good morning, just got 5 minutes to move into the afternoon, and a very warm welcome to what is the final session of INMS 2024. I have this unenviable task of introducing Pramod Nayar, right? And some of you remember this from last time. It is a very Sisyphean exercise, because by the time you finish introducing him, he may have written another book, published Pramod. So it's just, it's not going to happen. It's probably going to come to a point where if you go to Google and write Pramod Nayar, Google might snap back at you and say, seriously, you hate me so much, right? But I'll just touch upon some of the basic things. There's been a ton of books on pretty much everything from hunting narratives to imperial masculinity to ecopoetics, human rights. You can just go on forever. He's been a teacher, he's been a mentor. He's won the President's Award for academic excellence in our country. So everyone knows all of that. But I'll just deliver a little bit of an effective introduction, if I may. I think for our generation, when we were sort of trying to get into academia in this country, looking for a role model, someone to look up to, someone that you try to emulate, maybe get closer to, this was a man for not just me, for several people before, after, and I think it continues to inspire us. He's been around. He's been the most talkative person in this this conference. I had to sort of literally shut him down right now and make him sit down. He has the curiosity and the imagination of a 17-year-old, which explains so much in terms of what he does. And I think I said this last year as well. I think for everything you do, whether you're a footballer or a musician or academic, you need a benchmark, something that you can make a run for. Knowing fully well you're not going to make it, but you still need that mark. You still need that golden standard, as it were. And for me, Pramod Nayar is that benchmark. I think knowing, again, fully well, I'm never going to get even close to what he is, but it's still worth a run. It's still worth getting close to. And it is an extremely emotional moment for me to introduce him. So please join me in welcoming for the final plenary of INMS 2024, Pramod Nayar. Yeah.
Thank you, Abhishek. It does seem that I'm perpetually here. Every time Abhishek and Merin think of a conference, I'm here. It's like those who know their films, I'm sure Rajesh remembers, whenever Hindi films, I'm talking Hindi films, all the credits will end with and Pran. It's a bit like that. That's the title of his autobiography as well. It's called And Pran. So you couldn't have films without his presence. I'm sure Anjali also knows that. So thank you. It's always fun to be here and looking at the diverse papers that are presented, the panels, the plenaries. I particularly should thank Catherine for her very meticulously organized talk. It's very enviable that you can put together thoughts in that particular fashion. I am at best a rather chaotic thinker and writer, so my prose goes all awry most of the time. And I will not even mention punctuations, marks, so they're terrible. In the kind of work that this center is doing, I've seen the shift across the last few years, and the focal areas have become more and more relevant, more and more topical. It also does very interesting stuff in terms of the collaboration between theoretical, empirical work. It brings in the cognitive materialist philosophies, epistemologies, which I find particularly interesting. I was also impressed by the fact that the papers selected do at some point tie in with the conference theme. It's not like the thing with which several of us used to travel in our childhood, something called a trunk. You put everything in it. It can be used to sit down children or the older people, it was this very unwieldy iron box kind of thing. Its advantage was it was practically undefeatable. And you can fling it, you can sit on it, you can push it and shove it, and the trunk remains the trunk. It's a bit like Batman, invincible. There's nothing you can do with it. And most conferences in India, unfortunately, are like that. Everything goes in there. And sometimes you wonder, was that the same conference? Because the paper sounds something else. So the conference will be XYZ in film studies, and then you listen to 3 papers on Aboriginal poetry. How on earth is this film studies? Except for the fact that there are people filming it. It has actually nothing earthly to do with films. But I find that Abhishek and Merin do take a lot of time to prune the lists. But it's finally like an iffy setup, right? I mean, whatever you do about selecting abstracts, people will do what they want. And the abstract, the title, and the paper delivered are 3 entirely different things. And it's a great act of cognitive gymnastics by which the audience will say, oh, that's how it connects, because otherwise there isn't one. So I can understand the problem of organizers. I was told that they received upwards of 700, 600 plus. So and they're very nice people. So they don't want to say no. But at some point, they're also academics. And part of academia, if you have all graded papers, is to say no. And no, this is not going to work. This just does not work. And this ought not to work. So I'm very grateful for the opportunities that Abhishek and Merin insist on giving me. And my talk, although it sounds extremely jargonish, I understand, Ichnopoiesis and Planetary Memory, Geotrauma and Postcolonial Ecopoetics. I don't seem to have used any single syllable word in the whole title, but I hope it'll get clearer as we go. So, okay, here goes. So Jayanta Mahapatra in Dawn writes about the footsteps of a few who walked on them, so that the grass with ancient heavy feet has remained in the frail shelter of that sound. The land remembers, even shapes itself around the sounds of footsteps in Mahapatra's lines. In Simon Ortiz's first one, From the Set Forming Child, the child's tremble in the womb is described as, quote, a beating of wings following ancient trails to help us return. John Kinsella, arguably Australia's most significant poet, in Now Only a Dent in the Earth Marks the Site of These Dwellings, opens with 3 verbs with a full stop after each. Trench, full stop. Excavate, full stop. Layer. Widely separated in terms of cultures and nations, Ortiz, Mahapatra, and Kinsella's writings embody an ecopoetics of planetary memory. I read a collection of poets from Native American traditions, Aboriginal, Australian, and Canadian, African, and others to formulate this ecopoetics. Planetary memory, I argue, is cast in these poets from the formerly colonized nations and peoples as Ichnopoiesis. I employ the term as a spin on the term Ecology, which is the study of fossil traces, the tracks in the ground by animals and plants from ages ago. Ichnopoiesis is the making of a world through traces and tracks. Traces exemplify continuity, but also what I'm calling biogeophilia, which is my spin on Jeffrey Jerome Cohen's geophilia, the love of stone. But it's, for me, biogeophilia, a love of current material lives embedded in matter that carry traces of local lives and local histories. However, I suggest that when we discern an ichnopoiesis, that is, poiesis being meaning-making and world-making, that occurs across poets and poems from very different cultures and history, it is possible to see the phenomenon as gesturing at a planetary condition, at least in this kind of reading, where the poems are extracted beyond and outside the contexts in which they are usually read, in order to make them speak with an outside and beyond the immediate. In other words, this is a post-colonial poetics for the planet. So I'll start with poetic stratigraphies, layers. In Simon Ortiz's What My Uncle Tony Told My Sister and Me, the speaker recalls the avuncular advice to respect the land. The poem, which has a clear didactic tone and set as a series of injunctions, concludes with, everything that is around you is part of you. This is the advice given. Everything that is around you is part of you. In Les Russell's Australian Aboriginal writer, Red, the speaker declares that the color of his blood and that of the earth is red, and therefore he's a part of the earth. The speaker then goes on to inventory items, living and non-living, with whom he shares this red-colored blood: animals, the pea, flowers, trees, and the sun. And the poem concludes with, "For all things are a part of me, and I am a part of them." The emotions themselves are the result of intersubjectivity. They arise from contact with the ground. It's very important to recognize that. Thereby locating the world around as constitutive of the self. This sense of embeddedness in and connection with to the world, especially the ground, reaches an apotheosis in another Aboriginal poet Hylas Maris. In her spiritual song of the Aborigine, Maris goes on to list the many identities she has. She says she is the river, the snow, the wind, the red rocks, and the elements. She's also, she says, the eagle, crow, snake, and other creatures. She concludes with, "I am this land, and this land is me. I am Australia," which will recall for you both Whitman and other Australian authors before this, especially A.D. Hope's The Death of a Bird and Australia, the two canonical A.D. Hope poems. The post-human vision culminates in her becoming Australia itself, because Whitmanesque, she encompasses multitudes. Embeddedness, connections, rootedness, and linkages, compounded by traces cast in material forms such as rocks, soil, and even liquid topography, constitute the human and the non-human. There is no distinction between human and non-human, or even between living and the non-living, in this vision of the connectedness of all matter. While Ortiz's speaker lists all the people the young ones are connected to and ought to respect, only one item is in that inventory is given the suffix "the beginning," land. Land is the beginning, nothing else is. Ortiz's speaker emphasizes that this land, its matter, is where we begin, but also other life forms. And although we believe we come from parents and families and genealogies, only this matter can be termed the beginning. See, he very clearly states that human origins of the human are less important. This view of origins merges human genealogies with that of the land, refusing to disentangle one from the other. Deep in the earth lie buried the ores and mineral lodes that drew the human. But as Deborah Miranda, Australian Aboriginal poet, observes in her poem Indigenous Physics, the element colonizatium, the toxins and useful minerals, plants and heavy metals are entangled in unobtrusive ways in the earth. Her focus in the plant world, which cleanses the soil and waterways after the humans have caused their toxification, she writes this: maize, mustard greens, sunflowers, blue sheep fescue, and canola transform heavy metals. The same way water hyacinths suck up memory, lead, cadmium, zinc, cesium, strontium, 90 uranium, and pesticides. The same way bladder campion accumulates copper. Indian mustard greens concentrate selenium, sulfur, chromium. The same way willow absorbs uranium and petrochemicals, and once the willow's biomass concentrates heavy metals. Here, Miranda is not offering an instrumental view of the plant life that cleans the water or the soil. Rather, she's speaking of a certain type of food chain where the dangerous elements serve the plant's purpose. The sheer variety of plants that assimilate and therefore neutralize toxic metals and matter is an endorsement of the planet's attempt to regulate dangerous substances and rewrite its own memory. For Samuel Vaughan Watson in Future Primitive, the human's passage across the earth is marked by three powerful verbs. And this is how he writes it: hungry across the land, chewing, tearing, screaming. Those are the three descriptors for how humanity lives. As a race, the humans have been producing matter from Earth Mother. Earth Mother is his Watson's term, referring to mineralogical explorations, drilling, and factories built on the land. In Roberta Hill's These Rivers Remember, she cautions us against seeing only the surface area that has been built up by human civilizations. In this particularly profound stratigraphic poem, she writes, beneath the tarmac and steel in St. Paul, roots of the great wood are swelling with an energy no one dare betray. From this point, the poem attempts a quick history of the region, the savannas and their fauna, the rivers and their ancient names, the harmony of the people and the changes that then set in. I must admit that there is quite a bit of romanticization of the natural world that happens in many of these texts, but that's more or less a given when you're looking at ecological poetry. The phrase center of the earth occurs twice in the poem, once at the opening and once as the last line. In Hill's consciously biogeophilic poetry, the emphasis is the harmony that has been for millennia sedimented in the terraqueous terrain, in the land, the rivers, the trees, and the people. Refraining from sounding completely elegiac or even nostalgic, Hill refers to the region as the center of the earth, but leaves it open-ended whether she means a central location on the planet or the deeper geological center of the earth. We never can quite figure out. Harmony and mutual dependency, I suggest, is the center of the earth, which holds the planet together and is a stabilizing influence. The connectedness of all layers and the inhabitants of the layers constitute the very planet's existence. And layers are planetary memory. Everything radiates outward from the center. Lorato, Navajo poet, also focuses attention on the center of the earth as she recounts the origins of her people in one of her poems. Her people come, as she puts it, from the umbilical center of the sacred earth. Not only is this center lost, the very land has been colonized by Europeans, and Tohei recalls the history of displacement, violence, suffering endured by her people. For Gabriela Spears-Rico in Ecology for Ramona, in memory of the Zapatista warrior Ramona, she says, she's a unique woman warrior in a land where, I quote, women crafted from clay emerge from the center of the earth. So the center of the earth becomes a key theme in all these texts. Samuel Watson presents two histories of the land, the Bora of the Aboriginal peoples and the European histories in other lands. European exhibitions of culture, civilization, and the arts do not account for Aboriginal developments and histories, he argues. In the he's talking about an exhibition, and the poem is titled Cheap White Goods at the Dreamtime Sale. In the expo, the critics, as he puts it, neglect the Rubenesque roundness of a Bora ring. Here, Watson is not merely foregrounding a history of colonial thieving. He calls them murderers turned trustees, is how he describes the Europeans doing art. But also pointing to an entirely different kind of the history of the lithic. The Neolithic additive that is missing from the narrative of global civilizational progress is that of the Aborigines. The Aboriginal sites such as the Bora, which have considerable significance for the community, is no longer listed. That is, the New Stone Age, the Neolithic, is measured solely in European terms when similar and parallel developments did occur among the Aboriginals as well, so two different Neolithic traditions. In other words, Neolithic and the associated connotations of newness is ascribed only to the Europeans. Watson is gesturing at forms of the historical narrative that forever positions the Aboriginals at the primitive and pre-modern end of the evolutionary scale, even when the Neolithic can be found among the Aboriginals as well. So when you map the European history, you have the Paleolithic and the Neolithic. Apparently that never happened in the Aboriginal community. So the Lithic and the Neolithic, which represent the layers of a community's life therein, do not matter, except when these are of European provenance. Watson's Poetics of Prosopo Bio-stratigraphy, which is prosopo being community, bio being biological, and stratigraphy, which is layers. So the layers of the land are about biology, people, community, and all forms of life. Offers a critique of the exclusionary and discriminatory poetics of the colonial, of the key colonial memory structure, the museum, wherein some stories and layers are ignored, even perhaps erased. Ojaide's Delta Blues is dedicated to Kensaro Wiwa and other environmental activists executed in 1995. And the poem is a dual elegy for the land and for the people who fought for the land. Ojaide also opens with a layered image, with a stratigraphic image. The inheritance I sat on for centuries. The inheritance I sat on for centuries. This inheritance of the speaker and his community will come to haunt them. But for now, the speaker is nostalgic about the evergreen and the rivers. In stanza 3, the tone changes. My nativity gives immortal pain, masked in barrels of oil. Oil, as we know, fossil fuels, are the product of about 250 million years of evolution. It's the sediment from pre-human times that we are connected to, which means effectively our memory is actually planetary memory because we thrive on fossil fuels which are 250 million years old. But as somebody pointed out, it took 250 million years to produce oil. It required us 400 years to finish it off, right? The inheritance is this oil, which produces much suffering in the people whose land it is. Ojaide references the prospectors and what he calls barren robbers who have come prospecting for oil and displace the natives. And I find the term prospect particularly interesting because prospecting is digging into the ground. But prospect is also a particular view. John Barrell writes about the prospect view in the 18th and early 19th century aesthetics, where the landlord stands upon a promontory and looks at the land and says, this is what I own. And arguably one of the more famous prospect views would be in Caspar Friedrich's Wanderer Looking Over a Sea of Fog, the famous 19th century painting. The movement between surface, native lives lived on the land, and the depth, the oil, is a movement in time. Because the time of sitting calmly and enjoying the landscape, which then becomes the time of prospecting and mining, and that's planetary memory for you. So the life on the surface, life under the ground, or life which has become sedimented as oil under the ground. The life on the surface hinges on the layers below, layers which carry oil, which is why more and more people are talking about calciferous fiction, or what's now called Paleolithic fiction, fossil writing. The images of depth and layers persist from the very opening lines, inheritance as Saturn, and continues in his image of womb and mounds and things like that. Finally, he concludes, he's referring to the graves of Ken Saro-Wiwa and others, saying, the inheritance I was blessed with now crushes my body and soul. What crushes him is the oil from under the ground and the entire civilizational project of the natives being destroyed. The womb of fortune is used ironically. The fortune that emerges from the earth is actually ruinous. The womb metaphor also links to the term he uses, birth/right. Ojede speaks of later in the poem, a right that has now been denied. The birthright, that is the land and its depths, have been violated, just as the land itself has been. Other poets also point to the massacres and graves that constitute the legacies of the post-colony. This is Irish poet Ewan Boland's Witness, a poem in the poem cycle Colony in the Lost Land collection, which she concludes with a rhetorical question. What is a colony, if not the brutal truth that when we speak, the graves open and the dead walk? What is a colony, if not the brutal truth that when we speak, the graves open and the dead walk? In his famous Dhauli, Jayanta Mahapatra links the absence of the fecundity in fields with the massacres that occurred there, what he calls the fallow fields in which red-smeared, voiceless bodies lay buried. The earth, he writes, burrowed into these bodies. The sense of place, its history then, is divided between the quality of the earth, fallow, and the material symbolic, red-smeared, voiceless layer, surface and depth. In other cases, it's water and not land that conceals and contains ancestral residue in Mahapatra's famous one, Relationship, where he speaks about those maritime ancestors who have vanished in the Black Bay without a trace. A poem which is very resonant with Derek Walcott's powerful The Sea is History. Mahapatra implies that the water bodies continue to carry ancestral memories, and the ancestors live, as he puts it, in the sound of the waves. Mahapatra, Boland, and other poets suggest that the buried predecessors, family members, citizens define the colonial experience and its legacies. So it's not just a blame game where you blame the whites for everything that has gone wrong, right? How much of a nationalist and patriot you are. With this heightened awareness of signs of predecessors and ancients, of inheritances and birthrights, Prosopo Bio-stratigraphy embodies an entire poetics of traces and tracks. In Simon Otis's poem, which I quoted when I began, a child is being welcomed into the world, and the child's tremble in the womb is described thus: a beating of wings following ancient trails to help us return. One observes that Ortiz casts the child's movement or heartbeat in the womb in avian terms. Butterfly, bird, we are not very clear. Imagery, avian imagery, leading us to ponder over the implications. I suggest that Ortiz is aligning three things here: the non-living tracks in the land, the human life form in the womb, and the non-human life forms. The beating of wings leaves, for all practical purposes, no traces in the air. The ancient traces in the land may be discernible or not. The fetus's heartbeats and movements are, however, tangible and traceable. Ortiz's Ichnopoiesis maps the three traces onto each other, so you can no longer separate. This verse sets the tone for the biogeophilia of the creation tales, and he writes in the next poem, which is predictably titled the second one. He says, I will point out your place on the earth, among mountains, on ground, by old watercourses, in wind, where your mother walked, where her mother walked. Ortiz projects here every individual as an iteration of a longer genealogy, all of whose members are connected to the earth. Just as the earth itself, its very topography, is an instantiation of lives lived there. The places his mother walked and her mother before her are the newborn's place as well, for the place has been marked or traced for him. The newborn is a footsteps traveler, a particular tradition of travel writing called footsteps travel. Right? Retracing, reiterating, and redrawing those who have gone ahead or before. Ortiz also refuses to make flat terra firma the sole terrain for the people. The mountains, watercourses, the wind, and the level ground are all equally important. So it's not just traces on the land. If in first one, the earlier poem, we have the child following ancient trails, in the second one, practically all material forms, water, wind, earth, carry traces, are all possible sites where the newborn could be placed. Traces in Ortiz's poems exemplify continuity, but also biogeophilia, where material lives are embedded in matter that carry traces of previous lives, of entire generations and genealogies. Much biogeophilic poetry from the global south is concerned with traces of individuals, families, predecessors, and ancestors. This poetry is deeply interested in materiality and matter, whether of the human, the non-human, or the non-living. It thinks in terms of rootedness and traces of culture, antiquity, and therefore a certain Ichnopoiesis marks the poems. Ichnopoiesis is a sense of wonder that characterizes poetry interested in traces and tracts, mostly of predecessor civilizations and cultures. A clear instance of stratigraphic aesthetics where the present is read into and in terms of the past, however vague and ambiguous the traces of this past may be, Ichnopoiesis serves the purpose of linking human and geological stories/histories in the poetry. For Linda Hogan, arguably one of Native America's most significant ecological poet, in her poem, The Sandhills, the wind is the language of the cranes, and it has blown for millions of years across the land. With each season of their arrival, she says, the ancient story is made new. The wind tells, in the process, the translated story of life across the sky. That's her term, the translated story of life across the sky. The wind is speaker, translator, and author. It authors the story that it takes from the cranes. The writing of the story is across the sky, and thus is a roof over the world. The traces here of what she calls ancestral longing, presumably of lands and cultures now lost, are literally sky high. The wind is, in Auden's evocative phrase, the climate under which we lead our lives. That's Auden in praise of Sigmund Freud, whom he described as the climate under which we lead our lives. Ni Osundure, African writer, in the course of his longish poem, Waiting Laughter, speaks of the wound, quote, wound lodged in the spine of swindled mountains. Note the metaphor slipping across the human, corporeal, and the geological. Pointing to the geotrauma, and that's the second part of my talk because much of Ichnopoiesis emerges from what I'm calling geotrauma. Pointing to the geotrauma inflicted by human actions, swindle referring to, of course, mining, which causes cuts in the earth's crust. In Tanure Ojaide's Witnesses, he writes that the marks on the land are not beautifying tattoos. They are scars of pain inflicted through human greed. Everything in the land, suggests Ojaide, shrinks the mighty mountain. And he says, no mountain grows bigger the more it's quarried. Mountains don't grow. That's the whole point. When these poets attempt to describe and attribute causes, principally colonialism, to the traces which are mostly injuries and scars on the land, we understand that Ichnopoiesis is in fact geotrauma, where I'm using geo to include not just terra, but also aqueous terrain. So it's not a literal geo as of the earth, but it includes all forms of terrain. Ichnopoiesis is the poetics of geotrauma, capturing the injuries, the barrenness, the loss of soil quality, the markers of destruction and erosion of the terrain, and the consequent displacement of aboriginals, the loss of their habitat, their ways of life, and of course the disastrous effects on fauna and flora. The dents and scars are scar tissue, the traces of a history of violence. John Kinsella focuses on geotrauma as Ichnopoiesis, and his long poem Divine Comedy, I wouldn't recommend that you read it. It's 580 pages of poetry. It's a reworking of Dante. And since nobody reads Dante, I assume nobody will read Kinsella either. Unless you are on a deserted island and the only thing left for you as reading material is Dante. John Kinsella also focused on geotrauma's Ichnopoiesis. In Now Only a Dent in the Earth Marks the Site of These Dwellings, which is the segment of his poem. He opens with 3 verbs, like I cited before: trench, excavate, layer. The later verbs are about disturbing the grounds and the resulting geotrauma: unearth and disinter. Those are the other 2 verbs he uses: unearth and disinter. What also emerges as we excavate and disinter is a history. It's a history that people do not wish to know or recall. This is a history, as he puts it, of coolies and navvies. That's when you begin to make the connection. A sign remains, and the sign says, convict hiring depot. That's the only sign that's left. In Seamus Heaney's The Graubeil Man, based of course on the fossil discovery of the Graubeil Man, about the fossilized remains of a 3rd century BC human found in Denmark. And Seamus Heaney is important for, where is Kannan? Kannan isn't here. Interested in, on mud. Seamus Heaney is interested in bog. And we have something called bog poetics in Heaney. Heaney's argument is that bog and the mud from the bog is what gives him his Irish identity. Arguably the most significant poet of the bog is Seamus Heaney. In Seamus Heaney's The Graubeil Man, about the fossilized remains of a 3rd century BC found in Denmark, he compares the wrists of the fossil to a bog oak, the bog oak is a subject of an entire poem in his 1972 volume, Wintering Out. And he notes the signs of a violent death. So Graubeil Man is a fossil which shows signs that he died because his throat was slashed. And he refers to the signs of violent death. But he's also struck by the paradox that, and this sounds like a nightmarish scenario out of a Netflix series, that the dead appear so animated. And he asks, Heaney, who will say corpse to his vivid cast? He's so vivid. And how do you refer to him as dead or corpse? Heaney implies that the fossil being unearthed from the bog is akin to a new birth. The fossil's hair is like that of a fetus, and this is description from the poem. And the head and the shoulders are bruised, like in the case of a forceps baby, as he calls it, forceps baby within quotes, while implicitly referencing the cycle of birth and death embedded in the land, in the layers of the land. Heaney reflects on the violence that is human history, a violence whose evidence periodically surfaces literally like the Graubeil Man. For A.K. Ramanujan in Traces, the earth has what he calls layers of temporality with, quote, shelves of fossils. These fossils, he writes, quote, carry traces of anything that will leave a trace, which includes in Ramanujan's lovely inventory, leaves, seeds, shells, among others. Ramanujan then points out that these material artifacts from a completely different temporality serve an important function for humans who will decipher these fossils in order to give themselves a history, a past, and eventually a family tree. And decipher and family tree are his terms. That is, materiality generates discursive, narrative, and symbolic connections. The earth literally provides a history. Here, Heaney's Anthropocene poiesis revolves around remaking the contemporary around the traces of the ancient and the primordial. Everything leaves a trace, so that the present world remains indebted to the continuing materiality of and from the past. Kinsella's Ichnopoiesis may not be solely about fossil traces and the paleontological discoveries. As Kinsella puts it, it's paleo up to a point. Kinsella's ichnopoetic mode focuses on subsurface histories and their tangible visible signs. The earth offers signs of human history, buried inside its layers, but also made visible when human actions such as excavations take place. Bronislaw Dzerzhinsky has argued that planetary memory has 3 forms: the energy buried in the earth, residual heat from formation times; matter, fluids that carry memories of dissolved structure; and space, the shape or arrangement of something. He proposes that, I quote, lithospheric memory becomes both an archive of different deformation events which can be read by an outside observer, but also consequential in that it affects the behavior of that geological formation in the future, which is why people like Catherine Youssef are now speaking of geological subjectivity and geological life. When Samuel Watson writes of, quote, the hopeless arguments of history, and this is, quote, the hopeless arguments of history palpitating gently into the cracks of stoneware earth. In his poem Cold Storage, Wagon is presenting human and planetary memory in that one phrase. Let me repeat that. The hopeless arguments of history palpitating gently into the cracks of stoneware earth. The arguments of history, as he puts it, are obviously about human history on the planet and or in that particular place. But the earth's texture, stone, is cracked and thus enables the history to be buried in it. And you might recall Reflections on a Great House, or the Walcott poem, also The Ruins of a Great House, which also do the same thing. But the earth's texture, stoneware, is cracked and thus enables history to be buried in it, compounding the geotrauma. Wagon's Ichnopoiesis suggests that the same crack in the earth can provide a glimpse of the human history within it. History has deformed the lithic, left traces in the rock. But, he implies, this history of colonization, slavery, corporate greed does not quite go away. It affects the geological and the historical formation in the future. Wagon is pointing to the persistence of history and historical memory, sedimented into the very layers of the land. History is inscribed deep into geological matter. Other poets are careful in their Ichnopoiesis, and they distribute their attention across human and non-human traces. Simon Ortiz, another absolutely lovely Native American writer, in his poem, The Bend in the River, begins with a human observer watching the Arkansas River, rippling over pebbles, and he notes that glacial stone moves slowly. And those of us, and you are interested in this, the glacial movement is a specific time. We call it glacial time. It's a time different from human time. Right? And he notes, glacial stone moves slowly. As the poem proceeds, we see the same observer discovering many tracks at the river's edge, tracks of the raccoon, the coyote, the deer, and the crow. The riverbank then is inscribed within the reminders of the non-human. And Ortiz, after listing all these non-human presences, at least in the form of the tracks, writes, and now my own. His tracks, that is the human's tracks, merge with the tracks by several other non-human creatures. Planetary memory etched on the terrain, in this case land, is a mix of multiple life prints, human and non-human. The river, traditionally the source of life with human civilizations being established along rivers in all parts of the world, carries on its banks the signs of different life forms. The humans is only one among many. Although the human may have had a more powerful, definitely more destructive impact on the planet, as those who endorse the Anthropocene epoch argue, Ortiz implies that the inscriptions on the surface messily merge the human and the non-human. When Ortiz's Old Hills ends, Old Hills is the poem, we have a prominent topographical feature, the hills, denuded. And he says it's worn down to a flatness. So there's a whole hill that has been denuded to the level of the ground. The stones of these hills, writes Ortiz, quote, remember being underwater and the cool, fresh green winds. And those of you who read novels like Stephen Baxter's Evolution, which begins with Pangea, the earliest supercontinent to the present, you will see him talking about fossil records and things like that, the landscape which has changed over the years, over millennia, and it's pre-human history. Ortiz bestows the land with memory. The stones that make up the hills carry memory. The traces of the wind and the water of the bygone era have reshaped the material structure, if you can think of it that way, the physiognomy of the stones. And if, as Wittgenstein said, meaning is a physiognomy, then what is the meaning of the stone? Some poems, like Ojaide's Recession, view even benign human interventions as dangerous for the planet. In this poem, Ojaide opens with a statement, quote, a wilderness recedes into a garden of eggplants in my palm. In the course of the poem, Ojaide refers to an injunction from a sick sage. And the injunction is, no amendment to natural laws, end quote. But the natural laws include, unfortunately, a locust infestation. And these, what he calls fragile destroyers, do destroy the crops. These and other, what he calls surprises, mark the season, presumably the agricultural season. The poem concludes with a slightly modified version of the opening line. If you remember, the opening line went, a wilderness recedes into a garden of eggplants in my palm. But the poem ends with, the wilderness recedes into a garden of eggplants in my bruised palm. There's a shift. And the bruised palm is that of the farmer. The indefinite article has been replaced by the definite one. And a wilderness has become the wilderness. The wilderness gestures at a particular space of wilderness that has now been claimed and tendered or rendered into a garden. The garden, a good example of man's intervention, standing in direct contrast to the wilderness in terms of the control over nature, is also devoid of variety. It's just an eggplant garden. Nature, it would seem, has shrunk to one species of plant life alone. The bruised palm refers to the calloused palms that result from working in the garden, the prize of transforming wilderness into a manageable plot. And that's the difference. And Ivan Boland has a poem about a plot which becomes a site. The land which becomes a site is immediately transformed from something natural to something built up by humans. That said, the verb recedes that Ojaide employs suggests withdrawal or going back. Thus, supposedly, nature goes back from not just a state of wilderness, but perhaps from humanity itself, when the latter starts to bound it, cultivate it, and therefore transform it. It's a rearrangement of nature itself. The bruised palm is a legacy of acting against nature and can be linked to the hapticity that marks human-nature interactions in the poems of John Kinsella and others. John Kinsella speaks about people who work and their palms are bruised, and he's got a nettle sting here and the break in the skin from working on the land. While the construction of the land may indicate, as critics have noted again about the garden in Simon Ortiz's poems, such as Returning It Back, a fight against the injustices of colonization, Ojaide is more ambivalent as to the end effects of such a project of gardening if it means that the wilderness is no longer available to the human. In Laura Tohe's poem, even the predictions of the arrival of the white man are cast in the language of hapticity, touch. Quote, they would arrive wearing metal coats, riding strange, beautiful animals, would arrive in clothes that brushed the earth, carrying crossed sticks to plunge into the land. Here, Tohe shades the brush of the cloth, a superficially tactile event, into the more violent one of the sticks plunging into the Navajo's homeland. The light touch of the coats and cloth is a preliminary to a deeper and more violent haptic connection that the conquistadors would forge with the Native Americans' sacred land. In Nunakal's community rain song, the rains have been delayed, and the Aboriginal community hopes their song will bring the rains. However, Nunakal is careful not to romanticize the power of the community or its cultural practices. She observes that, quote, the strange words of the rain-making song, handed down through countless generations, are not understood now, but faithfully repeated. Nobody understands those things any longer. And she's quite matter-of-fact about it. Cultural memories are no longer preserved from one generation to the other. Nunakal says, although she does not sound quite elegiac in her account. Much of ecopoetry is elegiac in tone. It seems to be the most dominant form in which you can write about this. She then goes on to describe the singing itself. Some of the words themselves are described in terms of rain. From the ranked one community rose the toneless monotone of showers. The purpose, she says, is, quote, to reproduce the universal sound of steady rain, so the human voices and the sound of the rain. Whereas animals also echo the chants and the sounds, and therefore the non-human and the non-living also crash and clash with each other. The wind, she says, whoops. Thunder arrives with, quote, a double shattering crash, and the rain roared. The community disperses, laughing and screaming, into the caves as the rain comes down. Nunakal's poem moves from human sounds to the sounds of the elements. Once the elemental sound of the rain appears in the poem, the human words disappear, and then there is only laughing and screaming. Nunakal provides an entire vocabulary of elemental sounds as noted above, but suggests that human sounds produce the materiality of the rain and its sound. But she achieves something more. The power of the words of the chant remains, even when their meanings are forgotten. That is, the mystical power of the words are present even in the absence of their import for the new generations, a kind of Derridian trace, in other words. The power and, quote-unquote, true meaning of the words appear as traces, as the, quote, mark of the absence of presence. The meaning is not visible to the new generation. It is absent, and yet this absence invokes a hidden presence, forgotten and invisible but not erased because it's in the elements. Nunakal suggests that the traces of power, of meaning in Aboriginal cultures remain even when the next generation does not quite comprehend this power. While eventually the words produce the rain, so to speak, there is a clear link she draws between the words and the elements. Just as geological strata carry memories of evolution and human and non-human activity, the elements appear to have carried traces of the song's power, or the words or songs embody the elements that have appeared whenever enunciated. All the songs and their instantiations, rain, reappear, reiterate in the present too. Nunakal invokes this change in Aboriginal cultures where traditional meanings are lost, but not without traces, in a poem called Return to Nature. Here she speaks of hands and feet crossing the landscape, both now and, what she says, 1,000 years. Things have changed over time. The speaker mourns that and writes, "Now my civilized self stamps its imprints on reluctant sands." We're back to the earth image. Now my civilized self stamps its imprint on reluctant sands. Nature carries traces of human contact then and now. Nunakal's sorrow is that old imprints are lost and new civilized ones supposedly make their mark on the sands of time or the sands of nature. So much so that nature turns from human contact because nature remembers human brutality, or what she calls brutalness. I don't think the word exists outside Nunakal, but yeah. That is, human traces upon nature are remembered, planetary memory, and nature no longer can stand human touch precisely because of this memory, and nature doesn't want any more of that new memory. What previous generations of humans have done, brutalness, when they imprinted the land, is recalled, and nature now literally recoils from the present touch. As humanity is civilized, it loses literally its touch. Craig Santos Perez, arguably one of the most significant ecopoetic poetry practitioners today, in his poem Halloween in the Anthropocene, offers another form of the trace. Here the eyes of youth are what he calls open pit uranium mines. So he's speaking about Guam, and he says the eyes are pits of uranium mines. And he says they are veins, poisoned rivers, hearts, tar sands, tailings, ponds. Tailings is leftover after uranium mining. The human body carries traces of the place's corruption as the toxins enter the veins. The human is the embodiment of the place's evil materiality, so that geophagy, the destruction of the earth, phagy being destruction, geophagy becomes biophagy. So when you destroy the earth, what is also destroyed is life. Perez does not see the two forms of destruction of the earth and of the human form as distinct, because the mining operations into the earth brings out the uranium that then enters the human. It's not a life cycle you want. The inside human, outside the human, inside the earth, outside the earth binaries are no longer clear because the extrusions and extracts intrude into the human body. The open eyes of the boys are open mining pits. The veins are poisoned rivers. Perez avoids the simile route here, nor does he anthropomorphize the earth. That is to say, the ruined earth is traced within the human form. He's not interested in the earth any longer. Geotrauma, therefore, becomes biotrauma. When, for example, Gabriela Spears-Rico, another poet whom I've cited before, says that genocides and ethnicides, quote, would wipe out the people of copper, her specific tribe, this is the history of the Native Americans. For Ockwik in Soprano Man is also a famous fossil and also a phantom. Ockwik ponders over the Soprano Man and his traces. Rocks are words. Rocks carry what he calls chalk marks, which are, quote, both art and image. Ockwik, as noted before, offers multiple scales of time. The Pleistocene, the era to which the fossil has been dated, the Ice Age and its thawing, the age of the saber-toothed tiger, and the petrification of forests, which is the source of our fossil fuels. But Ockwik also references traces of this past, whether this is in the form of drawings and cave art or petrified forests. The changes in the earth, its geotrauma, leaves some evidence in some fashion. Today's earth retains the fossil, and not just as fossil, as he puts it. Those bones old, bones of Soprano clacking at the center of earth, echoing the hills. Remember, I began with the center of the earth image across poetry. those bones old, bones of soprano clacking at the center of earth, echoing the hills. The clacking of fossil bones and the echo are like the residual radiation of the formation of the universe, continuing presences of a bygone geological era. The primordial sounds echo this even today. So persistent is this absent presence, traces, that even a baby's, quote, brain capacity, as he puts it, is held like a fossil in the hand. You can only think of today's bodies as fossils in the making, and traces of the fossil are back with you. It's not enough to think in terms of fossil traces. Ockpick brings together continents when he writes of wolves and hyenas. With raised haunches in Mukluks in Africa, our old home, or with bare feet fleeing to Alaska, our new boreal forest. So, because life originated in Ethiopia and now the movement is to Alaska. These traces are correlations and embody his emphasis as an Ockpick's emphasis on globalization, continental drift, shared ice ages, and thaws. Ockpick, I suggest, brings together deep time, traces of past worlds and time, the progress within quotes, of resource extraction and geological paleontological explorations here. Ockpick calls attention to layers of rock shaped by ice, water, and time as relics of distant human culture. I'll conclude with a couple of more points. Stratigraphic poetry, as I've argued, with its keen interest in the haptic and other sensory relationships with the land, the immersion, so to speak, of the individual and collective in the land, and the traces and tracks in it, constitute an ecopoetics where human and non-human, biotic and abiotic, are entangled. In most cases, the history and fate of the land is mingled with those of the life forms inhabiting it. The poets make sure we sense and understand that the land, and please note that I'm not using land as just land, but land which includes water. I mean, it's odd, isn't it, that the planet is made of 70% water and we call it Earth. I mean, we should be called Oceania or something. I mean, how can a planet which is made of so much water be called Earth? Earth is a very insignificant component, right? And humans should also be called hydro creatures. 80% of our body is water. Right. The poets make sure we sense and understand that the land is cast within a political ecology in Latourian terms, so that the questions of nature, planetary memory, and stratigraphy are also questions of human agency and history, from the agricultural practices of tribes and communities to colonialism, and more recently, post-colonies and neocolonialism forms. This sense of the past, present, and future cast in biogeophilia, in the form of biogeophilia, is seen in Ben Okri's A Broken Song, a poem again dedicated to Ken Saro-Wiwa. Having described an Africa that has been pillaged, Okri suggests that we must, quote, wait for the unnatural times. He writes, only the unnatural ones can live at ease, while they poison the lands, rape her for gain, bleed her for oil, and not even attempt to heal her wounds. Only the unnatural ones can live at ease, while they poison the lands, rape her for gain, bleed her for oil, and not even attempt to heal her wounds. Where there were once, quote, proud trees of Africa, we now see deserts as the land bleeds. Numerous images of what Okri terms defilement run through this, a powerful poem of political ecology, where he paints a post-colony marked by greed, corruption, extractivist processes, and commercialization of natural resources. Biogeophilic poetry is, in the final instance, an instantiation of a political ecology because it refuses to see ecological injustice or deforestation or desertification in merely environmental terms, because they see these actions as linked to social inequalities and unjust practices visited upon the people and the planet alike. A world undone across colonial rule and post-colonial ruination invites a poiesis that captures the process, practices, and politics of despoliation, which are natural, quote, and cultural at the same time. This is Anthropocene poiesis. Thank you.